The Intergalactic Peacekeeper Academy was built into the hollowed shell of a dead moon, its surface scorched and glassed from a war no one dared name. The corridors buzzed with a low, electrical hum, lights flickering with the faint scent of sterilization agents. Cadets from over 47 species marched in perfect formation through its gleaming halls, most of them dreaming of glory, some simply hoping to survive. But even among the grueling drills, zero-grav combat modules, and biohazard survival tests, one trial hovered like a whispered curse among the trainees: the Voric Cub evaluation. It wasn't listed on any syllabus. There were no prep materials. Just the infamous black door marked Psychological Resilience Test 7, reinforced with containment-grade alloys and 2 armed guards who neither spoke nor blinked. Rumors were abundant. Khorne cadets had fled the chamber, their chitin armor scorched with claw marks. A Spalari recruit, capable of manipulating heat signatures, reportedly faked a fever to dodge the session. The Voric cubs weren't large, barely the size of a Terran beagle, but they moved like living razor-wire, spastic, loud, and infinitely unpredictable. And yet, every cadet had to face them. James Halstead stood just outside that door now, watching through the observation glass as the latest candidate, a feather-crested Tialan, with sharp memory and 0 body fat, was cornered by 4 growling furballs. One cub gnawed playfully at her ankle while another launched off her back, causing her to lose balance and fall in a flailing panic. The lights dimmed, simulating a cave environment. That was when the 5th cub emerged, having apparently waited under the floor grate for maximum theatrical timing. The Tialan screamed. A real, full-throated scream. Instructors made a note. A soft chime sounded. Test failed. Next came a crisp voice. James adjusted the Academy issue suit around his shoulders and stepped forward. His friend, a pale blue Zethari cadet named Skit, placed a hand on his forearm. It was oddly warm for an ectothermic species. "You don't have to do this, James," Skit whispered. 3 of his 6 eyes narrowed in worry. "You've already earned your flight rotation. This test isn't compulsory if you've—" "It is now," James said dryly. "They revised the protocols last week." "Because of those things," Skit muttered, glancing toward the glass where the cubs were now play-fighting over a torn uniform scrap. James gave a small shrug, trying to mask his own apprehension. "Don't worry, I've babysat worse." Skit blinked twice in a nonverbal expression James had learned to interpret as incredulous concern. The door hissed open. Inside, the chamber was stark concrete textured walls, a few fake boulders for cover, ambient lighting that mimicked cave shadows. And in the far corner, 5 Voric cubs, clustered like a war council. The moment the door sealed shut, the cubs froze, heads turned, slitted eyes locked on him, silence. James took a step forward. One cub twitched. He stopped. Another step. A low growl rumbled from the largest cub. James slowly exhaled, letting his weight shift slightly back to his heels. His stance relaxed. He sat carefully, cross-legged on the floor. No sudden movements. He made eye contact, just briefly, with the lead cub. Then he looked away, not submissively, but casually, as if he had better things to do than assert dominance. Like wait for a bus. "Hey, little guys," he said softly. "You're a lot cuter than the rumors said." No one in the observation chamber spoke. The instructors leaned closer. One tapped a sensor to monitor the cubs' heart rates. Another ran a scan of James's vitals. Pulse, 68 BPM, no adrenaline spike, cortisol levels stable. The largest cub prowled forward, sniffing the air. James didn't move. The creature's nostrils flared once-twice, then it bumped its head against his knee and flopped down with an audible sigh. "What?" muttered an instructor. 2 other cubs approached with more skepticism. One clawed gently at his sleeve, another bit his boot, then let go. James didn't flinch. Instead, he let his hand drift lazily toward the biting one and scratched gently behind its ear. It purred. 5 seconds later, the entire pack was climbing over him, making chirruping noises, batting at his collar, sniffing his hair. 10 seconds after that, they were asleep in his lap. James looked mildly confused. "Do I just sit here now?" Behind the glass, the room had gone silent. The chief behavioral assessor, a crusty Delvakian named Instructor Rowe, tilted her head, antennae twitching. "Run the scan again," she barked. "No signs of stress," replied the medtech. "His pupils are dilated only slightly. No glandular overproduction. Brainwaves show normal, low-level engagement. He's calm, not disassociating. Initiate auditory stressors," Rowe ordered. A sharp burst of static echoed in the chamber. The cubs barely stirred. James looked up. "Is that part of the test?" The tech turned back. "Still nothing. He's just fine." Rowe muttered something in Delvakian under her breath and keyed the intercom. "Cadet Halstead, what exactly are you doing?" James blinked. "Sitting. With a pile of apex predator infants on your torso." They seemed tired. A few cadets watching from the second-tier gallery snorted. Others whispered in unease. Skit was staring, open-mouthed. Back in the chamber, one cub was snoring. "We've had combat veterans come out of that room weeping," Rowe said. "You're telling me this is your first exposure?" James hesitated. "To predator cubs? Sure. But what?" He scratched his nose. "I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment with twin toddlers, a husky, a Labrador, and my cousin Trey, who had a ferret named Chaos. I learned early not to react to high-pitched noises, biting, or people climbing on me. You're saying this is comparable? The ferret used to sleep in my sock drawer. It chewed wires. Trey taught it to open cabinets." One of the instructors pinched his nasal bridge. "This is ridiculous." Rowe cut in again. "We'll speak more after. Do not move. We need to collect scent samples from your uniform." "Neat," James murmured, already shifting slightly to cradle the smallest cub more comfortably against his chest. It mewled in its sleep and drooled a little on his collar. Outside, chaos had erupted. Instructors argued over the relevance of the cub test for human psychology. A few medtechs suggested James might have a hormonal abnormality. Another theorized that humans emitted some kind of pheromone the cubs liked. Skit finally found his voice. I think he might just be normal, for a human." An instructor scoffed. "Impossible." Skit looked back toward the chamber. "You haven't met his cousin." The observation room emptied slowly. Some instructors lingered, muttering in their native tongues, while others stormed off, clearly irritated that years of psychological metrics had just been steamrolled by one unassuming human and a nap pile of predator cubs. James remained seated for another 20 minutes, until the last cub blinked awake, yawned with a flash of baby fangs, and trotted off with a sleepy whine. One by one, the others followed, dazed and docile, like kindergartners after story time. The moment the final cub disappeared through the auto-sealed hatch, the room's lighting reset to standard, and the intercom crackled again. "Cadet Halstead, proceed to decontamination, then report room C for post-evaluation." James stood slowly, brushing off fur and a suspicious glob of drool. He stretched, wincing slightly at the tingling deadweight in his legs. As he stepped through the exit, the airlock sealed with a puff of sterilizing mist. The decontamination sequence hummed to life-standard issue UV rinse, followed by a brief ion spray. Not painful, but annoyingly ticklish. By the time he reached the corridor, 2 instructors were waiting. One was Rowe. The other, a towering water-dense pluvian named Hezd, stared down at him with the same expression one might use when encountering a sentient fungus. "Follow," Rowe ordered curtly. James did. They led him to report room C, smaller, more sterile, and just slightly warmer than normal. The temperature difference wasn't an accident. It was part of the psychological design. Slight discomfort. Heightened pulse. Faster perspiration. James didn't sweat. He sat in the center chair, hands in his lap, back straight. The walls were blank but for one embedded screen, currently dark. Rowe paced. Hez loomed. Another instructor, a pale, floating Dorixian who communicated via electric pulses, silently hovered near the ceiling, observing. Rowe broke the silence. "Do you understand what just happened in that chamber?" "I believe so," James replied evenly. "We expected you to be overwhelmed." "I noticed. You were meant to be overwhelmed." The cubs don't merely test resilience, they trigger a cocktail of emotional and instinctual stress responses: fear, confusion, loss of control. Right, James said. So I failed the failure? Ro's antennae twitched violently. Hez shifted his weight with a sloshing sound. The Dorixian flickered a brief pulse. Ro translated. Explain, in detail. James nodded. Okay. First, when I entered, I didn't make sudden movements. I let them approach. I didn't meet the lead cub's eyes too long, but I didn't break contact too early either. That establishes a neutral presence. Instinctive behavioral modulation, Hest grumbled. Not instinct. Practice, James corrected gently. When you grow up with a house full of unpredictable chaos, siblings under 5, pets with separation anxiety, and extended family with zero spatial boundaries, you either learn to keep your cool or go clinically feral. Ro tapped something into her tablet. Your upbringing has been reviewed. We noted environmental disorder, but disorder does not equate to stress tolerance. James tilted his head. Have you ever tried making a sandwich while a toddler is screaming, the dog is throwing up on the carpet, and your cousin is microwaving a juice box? Ro blinked. No. Exactly. The screen flickered to life. Footage from the chamber replayed in silence, James seated cross-legged, cubs approaching. It paused when the first one curled up beside him. Hez leaned forward. We ran pheromone analyses. There was no chemical trigger, no sedative contamination. Your heart rate did not elevate. Your facial temperature remained constant. James scratched his eyebrow. I wasn't afraid. Why not? He hesitated, then offered a small smile. Because I didn't assume they wanted to hurt me. That gave them pause. Ro folded her arms. That is statistically rare, especially among cadets unfamiliar with Voric juveniles. I didn't need to be familiar, James said. I recognized the behaviors, testing boundaries, loud posturing. It's the same whether it's a cub, a toddler, or a Labrador that just figured out how to open the fridge. Silence. Then the Dorixian pulsed again. Rose sighed. He says we've been overcomplicating things. James chuckled. Wouldn't be the first time. Ro closed the tablet with a snap. You've passed the evaluation. There will be follow-up studies. You may be subject to controlled scent replication trials. Your schedule will reflect that. James stood. Understood. You are dismissed. As he left the room, the door slid shut behind him with a soft chime. The hallway was empty. At least, it was for 5 seconds, then came rapid footfalls, and Skit skidded into view, eyes wide. You're alive. Somehow, James replied, stretching his shoulders again. Think I've got fur in places I didn't know I had. They slept on you. I noticed. I once tried giving them nutrient pellets, and they bit through my utility belt. They didn't seem hungry, James shrugged. Skit opened his mouth, then closed it. You know they've started reviewing the evaluation protocol, right? James raised a brow. Seriously? Your reaction or lack of it skewed their data sets. Now they're wondering if humans need an entirely separate set of psychological benchmarks. James sighed. Fantastic. I'm going to get tagged every time someone wants to study human calmness, aren't I? Already happening, Skit muttered. A Lurvian cadet tried to smell your bunk pillow. James blinked. Why? He thinks your scent suppresses aggression. It smells like detergent and socks. Skit held up his hands. I'm just the messenger. Later that evening, the cadet lounge was quieter than usual. Conversations dipped when James entered. Some cadets gave subtle nods, others avoided eye contact. Skit trailed behind him with a snack pouch and a visible air of self-satisfaction. You broke the test. They think you're either an emotional savant or some kind of dormant empath. James slumped into a seat. I just didn't freak out. To most species, that is a superpower. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he watched the others Aliari twins, whispering in tight spirals, a Kulon stretching its hind limbs near the hydration station. The usual noise, but subdued. And when one of the Voric cubs appeared from under the lounge bench, blinking and stretching, no one dared approach. Except James. He whistled softly. The cub's ears perked. It trotted over, tail flicking. 3 more emerged after it. In full view of the entire lounge, the cubs climbed into James's lap, nestled into his arms, and fell asleep again. Skit nearly choked on his nutrient puff. You've been adopted. James sighed. Of course I have. Near the corner of the lounge, Instructor Rowe walked past with a datapad in hand. She paused briefly at the glass, saw the humans surrounded by sleeping predators once again, and closed her eyes. She didn't call security. She didn't file a report. She just walked away, muttering, I need a new rubric. By the next cycle, James had unintentionally become the most talked-about cadet at the Intergalactic Peacekeeper Academy. Not because he was top of his class, he wasn't. His scores were solid but unspectacular. His marksmanship was competent, his field navigation above average, and his theoretical command simulations acceptable if creatively odd. But none of that mattered anymore. Because wherever he walked, 5 Voric cubs followed. They weren't technically allowed outside their evaluation chamber, but protocol, as it turned out, didn't account for cubs who learned how to bypass biometric locks just to nap under a human's bunk. It started with soft paws under his blanket. Then came the trail of fur leading to his locker. Then the night when James woke up to find 3 of them wedged between his legs and another 2 sprawled across his chest, purring like organic engines. Security had been called. Security had left, confused and quietly terrified. Now the instructors were in full damage control. They are not pets, Instructor Rowe snapped, pacing the faculty conference room as a projection of James calmly brushing a cub's ears looped on the central screen. They're pre-instinctual hunters with socially selective aggression responses. Instructor Hest crossed his massive arms, eyes narrowed, and they have imprinted on him. This undermines everything we've built into the resilience program. It exposes fundamental flaws in our methodology. The Dirixian instructor, still hovering silently in the upper quadrant of the room, emitted a short pulse. Rowe scowled. Yes, I'm aware the cubs are biologically designed to trigger fear, not affection. The pulse came again. Fine, emotionally plastic, not designed. The outcome is the same. Hess leaned forward. Perhaps the fault is not in the cubs, but in our assumptions about humans. That quieted the room. We've long assumed their psychological durability manifests in fight-or-flight models, but Halstead's response suggests something else entirely. Emotional modulation, controlled receptivity. Or sheer dumb luck, Rowe muttered. We still don't know what part of him they respond to. Then we study it, objectively. The study began the next morning. James was summoned to Medical Observation 4, where a team of xenobiologists, behavioral analysts, and one vaguely apologetic empathy specialist waited with clipboards and scanning arrays. The Voric cubs came too, uninvited. James entered the observation suite with one on his shoulder, 2 tangled around his left arm, and the others padding softly at his heels. We tried to intercept them at the corridor, the empathy specialist said, somewhat breathless. One of them growled and made a sort of chirping threat hum. Yeah, that means back off, James explained, setting the shoulder cub gently on the counter. It's not serious unless they wiggle. Wiggle? The back legs. It's like charging a spring. The lead behavioral tech took notes furiously. They scanned his hormone levels, no anomalies. They ran olfactory tests, using exposed fabric swatches from James's uniform across multiple cubs. Each swatch was sniffed, then curled into. They analyzed his brainwave activity while he interacted with the cubs. No stress spikes, no overstimulation. Just low-level engagement, empathy markers active, and most bafflingly reduced amygdala reactivity under physical duress. He doesn't perceive them as threats, the empathy specialist concluded, even when they bite. They barely bite me anymore, James replied, rubbing behind one cub's ear as it melted into his lap. They mostly chew. A full medical analysis followed, and per the Academy's stringent rules was repeated 12 hours later. The results were identical. Eventually, even Rowe had to admit, this wasn't an anomaly. It was something new. Out on the training grounds, the shift in dynamics was more noticeable. Cadets who once jeered or joked behind James's back now watched him with visible uncertainty. A Tulai scout who'd previously mocked his slow reaction times now avoided sparring drills with him. A Spilari cadet, bold and overly confident, had tried to impress others by lunging near James during meal period. The cubs had reacted before James did. One landed squarely on the Spilari's face. Another pulled at his belt with the full force of compact muscle and mischief. There were no injuries, but the message was clear. The human was protected. After that, cadets kept their distance. Even Skit had started eyeing him differently. Still friendly, but now with the sort of caution one might show toward an object that looks harmless, but once exploded in a lab test. They sat together in the mess hall that evening, the cubs arranged like a semi-sentient blanket around James's legs. "You're the only cadet in history to fail a combat assessment because your test partners refused to engage you," Skit muttered, flipping through his datapad. Instructor Venn said it violated the impartiality clause of interspecies sparring. James looked up from his meal tray. "I didn't ask the cubs to defend me. They bit his kneecaps, James. I told them not to. They don't speak English. I use tone." Skit gave a low, nervous whistle through his teeth. This place was already hard. Now people think you're some kind of chaos-wrangling miracle. James poked at his food. "That's not helpful. Cadets want answers. They don't know what to do with you. You're not the strongest or the fastest or the most strategic, but you tamed a test designed to break us." "I didn't tame anything," James said. "They just settled." Skit leaned in. "That's exactly the problem." 3 days later, Rose summoned James for a private briefing. He entered her office, Spartan, angular, and noticeably Voric-free. She didn't look up from her desk. "Close the door." He did. "We've suspended the cub test." James blinked. "For how long?" "Indefinitely." He didn't respond right away. "Your success has raised too many complications. We've reviewed 6 cycles worth of data. The test has a 91% failure rate across species. It was never meant to be passed. It was a measure of boundary response under predator conditions." James folded his arms. "And now? We're re-evaluating. You've highlighted a blind spot in our understanding of psychological flexibility, particularly yours. So what happens to the cubs?" "They'll remain in monitored enrichment. For now." He nodded. Rose studied him. "You understand the impact you've had." James sighed. "Yeah, I just didn't mean for it to be a thing. You've changed how your peers see you, and how we see humans. I didn't plan that." "I know." Her gaze softened, just slightly, which is why it matters. As he turned to leave, she added, "Cadet Halstead?" He glanced back. "There's a small fur-covered menace curled under my desk. It's been there since morning. Kindly remove it." James crouched, lifted the cub gently, and gave Ro a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes they just pick a spot and decide it's theirs." "Exactly like humans," she muttered. As the door slid shut behind him, the cub in his arms gave a contented sigh. James rubbed its head and muttered, "You're really not helping my reputation, you know." It purred in reply. By the end of the training cycle, James Halstead's name appeared on more internal memos than any other cadet in the Intergalactic Peacekeeper Academy's recent history. Not for disciplinary reasons. Not for accolades. But because no one knew what to do with him. The cubs were now factored into his daily schedule. Officially, they were to remain in their behavioral enclosure under supervision. Unofficially, they had assigned themselves as his security detail, alarm clock, and mobile heating units. If the Academy insisted on leash protocols, the cubs chewed the leashes. If they were confined to habitat space, they slipped the vents and followed his scent trail through the ducts. After repeated failures to contain them, the Academy gave up. Instead, a new designation was filed in the administrative system. Cadet Halstead, accompanied by Voric juvenile units. 5. Clearance to all non-sensitive locations granted under Behavioral Exemption Clause 47C. It was unprecedented. It was bureaucratically painful. And it meant James couldn't go anywhere without being watched closely. The next major incident happened during the Interspecies Tactical Simulation Week. An annual affair, it tested cadets in cross-team scenarios, emergency triage, hostage negotiation, resource rationing under planetary collapse conditions. James was assigned to Blue Team. Skit was there too, along with 3 other cadets. A Talari female with excellent reflexes, a nervous Silith analyst who mumbled under pressure, and a surly Grax soldier with patience thinner than vacuum sealant. The cubs weren't technically on the roster. They came anyway. The first exercise involved a mock landing in a hostile terrain zone with simulated seismic instability, terrain shifting, low-grav inconsistencies, and hidden civilian units to rescue. Blue team moved in tight formation. James took rear guard partly because the Cubs liked to follow him, and partly because the Grax refused to turn his back on them. "They make this clicking sound," the Grax grumbled, eyes darting. "It's unnatural." "They're just communicating," James said. "It's more or less purring and echolocation combined." "I don't like it." "They don't like yelling. Maybe we all have things to work on." The Grax glared but said nothing more. Halfway through the simulation, a minor cave-in was triggered. The Talari was pinned under rubble. Skit was thrown backward and landed hard, groaning. The Silith panicked, flailing through the field pack. The Cubs reacted instantly. Two bounded toward the rubble pile, weaving through the debris, noses twitching. One began pawing at a pressure seam James hadn't noticed. He shouted, "There, help me shift this one, carefully." Together with the Grax, they lifted the slab just enough for the Talari to crawl out, blood simulated down her temple. The scenario runner watching from the ridge raised a brow. In the after-action report, Blue Team was commended for exceptional coordination under pressure and innovative use of animal-assisted terrain mapping. The Cubs were awarded commendation biscuits. James, once again, was called in for review. "Do you realize they identified a structural weakness we didn't program for?" asked Instructor Venn, a specialist in crisis logistics. "We checked. That slab was a flawed print." James shrugged. "They smell the microfractures. That's not in any training manual." "I don't think they've read the manuals." The instructors began drafting proposals. New division names were floated: interspecies assistive units, juvenile behavioral co-operatives, human integrated field companions. James just asked for more protein rations. The Cubs were growing fast. 3 weeks later, everything nearly unraveled. During a night exercise in Sector Delta, a real environmental breach occurred. A power coupling in the lower maintenance shaft overloaded, causing a cascading blackout across 6 training zones. Cadets were scattered. Emergency lights flickered on in patches. Communications were scrambled. James was asleep. Then he wasn't. The Cub on his chest hissed softly. Another tugged at his sleeve, ears pinned flat. He sat up immediately, instincts sharper now. "What is it?" The hallway outside his barracks was dark. Emergency protocols were drilled into every cadet. But what the manual didn't include was what to do when your unofficial Predator squad was already halfway down the corridor, noses to the floor, moving with intent. James grabbed his boots. "Wait for me." He caught up as the 5 Cubs veered right toward the auxiliary access. And that's when he heard it. A low, garbled distress call. One of the Spillari cadets had gotten trapped between 2 sublevels when the lift cut power. James dropped to the floor beside the shaft grill, pried it open, and peered down. The cadet was hanging by one arm, legs braced awkwardly against a misaligned support strut. "I can't hold," came the weak voice. James called back, "I'm coming down." The Cubs waited above. One paced, another sniffed the edges of the shaft. James lowered himself, grabbed the cadet's arm, and slowly shifted their weight. It wasn't graceful, but it worked. They both emerged 20 minutes later, shaky, bruised, and covered in shaft dust. The Cubs immediately began grooming the dirt from James's hair. It would have been funny if the Spillari cadet wasn't so close to sobbing. The next day, a formal commendation was issued for response initiative under infrastructure failure. It had 3 names on it: James Halstead, the rescued cadet, and, finally, a new entry: Voric Cub Collective 1 Ampere, behaviorally bonded unit, human adopted. Graduation neared. Cadets across species polished their uniforms. Final evaluations were posted. Assignments trickled in, slowly at first, then all at once. Some would go to the front lines, others to diplomatic outposts. A few were selected for research divisions. James hadn't opened his yet. He stood alone in the observation wing, looking out at the practice fields where new trainees were arriving. Beside him, one Cub curled around his boot. Skit joined him, his new uniform crisp, freshly printed insignia gleaming on his shoulder. "I'm assigned to Outpost Verdant," Skit said. Jungle colony. High moisture. They say I'll do well in it. James nodded. You will. Skit hesitated. And you? Haven't checked. You're afraid the cubs won't be included. James didn't answer. Skit tilted his head. You think they'll make you choose? James finally spoke. They're not equipment, they're not mascots. They're mine. The cub on his boot made a quiet huff, as if to second the sentiment. When James finally opened the assignment file that evening, he didn't recognize the division code. He looked it up. A new department. A pilot program, human-led cross-species behavioral interfacing, and tactical co-response unit. In other words, peacekeeping with teeth. His first posting was a frontier station in contested space. High tensions, fragile alliances, unstable terrain. Perfect for someone good at managing chaos. And he wasn't going alone. The final note on his transfer order was simple. Voric Cub Collective 1 Ampere authorized for active companionship under Halstead command. Status: non-combatant emotional regulation and threat de-escalation assets. There were no badges for that kind of work. No medals for staying calm when everything else went to pieces. But as the shuttle lifted days later, cubs curled at his feet, one perched lazily across the headrest. James looked down at the academy one last time. He hadn't changed who he was. He'd just helped the galaxy redefine what strength looked like. And it looked, sometimes, like a lap full of snoring apex predators and a man reading in peace.